Oh yeah. Let's see. And I'm gonna try out what these different things do. Ooh. Let's see which one. Oh, I like that. Let me come on the side. Ooh. Oh, whoops. I have my pod. I gotta put Tolkien heads back on. Dude.
Also, I just want to say, Tom, like out of all the lecturers, you're the one who actually looks the most dapper. I said it on the internet, but you're like rocking the turtleneck and the suit jacket.
Compensating for the fact that I am not, in fact, John Garth.
Aren't we all, though? Aren't we all, though?
It's a very nice hat, though.
Thanks much.
All right. Okay. I'm gonna make sure it's working. Will y'all talk amongst yourselves?
So, all right. So, Tom, where are you right now? Give us a lay of the land.
Where am I right now? I am I'm actually in Vancouver, Washington, not Scotland at the moment. I'm with family here before the PhD starts. So I've ensconced myself in a space with high quality Wi-Fi.
Excellent.
Yep.
Excellent.
When do you actually head over?
We head over, and our flat in Glasgow opens up on the 16th of September.
Look at that
So
flat. He's using the lingo already.
Yeah, he's practicing.
Indeed, I'm gonna. I have two kids. One is 19 months. The other is 5 months, and they're gonna come back from the UK with the most adorable Scottish accents. That's my hope.
Well, our youngest has a little after 3 years. Our 8-year-old who did lots of the early reading and all that kind of stuff has the most. And
Excellent.
So our oldest, he can turn it on, and I'm like, look, you're going into high school in the United States. Like, you should turn on your Scottish accent.
Yeah, he'll be exotic.
I know.
Oh my God, he'll be unstoppable.
You're like, I grew up the first 10 years of my life in Los Angeles before I lived in Scotland. And I have very thick, long hair. So
Southern California with a little bit of like British classiness, but oh my goodness. Unstoppable kid.
I know.
Also, I'm just saying that Elgin sounds like a 90s babe. Like, I feel like you have just created the perfect 90s like heartthrob.
He's like Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
He's like, it's like if he was like a boy interest in an Alicia Silverstone movie.
Oh, well. There's a niche group of people that are like, I didn't know you could have kids that cool. Love interest of Alicia Silverstone in the 90s. All right. Well, you ready for me to hit record? Since everything's like working and we're all here at the exact same time. I mean, I don't even know what to do with this.
We're really not clicking?
No, there's no clicking, Jason.
Brilliant.
And I hear Tom and his lips match when he's moving, and his internet doesn't seem like it's going to disappear. Nick's beard is still like Durin level. Yes. And, yeah. So those of you that are on the stream and such, oh, look at this. Ryan appreciates all of us being here at the same time working. That's what I like. And we have a Facebook user who totally gets the reference. I'm guessing this is an Alicia Silverstone fan. But this is fun. Thank you for everyone being back the very next day after John Garth, and I'm looking forward to Tom trying to, follow John Garth. Good luck. Luckily, Jason's here this time. He's not skipping us for his chemo treatment, using that old excuse. Tom, he wrote a book about having cancer, so you're allowed to make comments about it.
You are.
Though I have to say, first Theology Beer Camp, one of the first bits that happened at Theology Beer Camp, First Bits at Theology Beer Camp was me interviewing him, asking the most awkward questions about cancer, to about 20% of the room getting in on the joke, and the other 80% feeling more and more awkward. And Jason just answered them in the most straightforward way, and I kept making awkward cancer jokes. And I thought it was one of the funniest things and was so excited about it. And I realized everyone just drank for 2 hours. There's like this wild, energetic beginning. I'm like, I'm going to talk to my friend Jason. And then I'm like, yeah, so you have cancer. You wrote a book about it? Anyway, it got worse. It went downhill.
Speaking of better books, are you ready, Tom?
Yeah, I'm going to hit the air horn. Yeah. But yes, Ryan. See, look at this, Ryan.
You left out the part where I had the police called.
Oh, we'll do that at the end of the podcast. If someone reminds us, we'll hear a story of Ryan Michele using the fact that he just had chemo to get out of trouble with a cop at Theology Beer Camp. After
Well, to be fair, I'm also white, so that helped.
That's always,
Absolutely.
Well, this was in Redondo Beach, your old stomping ground.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and they're notoriously selective. All righty, I'm gonna hit. There you go. No, I want yes. There you go. Oh yeah, that air horn, the most exciting purchase I made in lockdown. A new recorder that has an air horn button, and it gets me hyped because guess what? It's time for Tolkien Heads. Yeah, that's right. Back-to-back days where Tolkien Headery is happening right here on this stream. We had a lot of people hanging out live, plenty of people back-to-back days, because yesterday we hung out with like the one and only John Garth, and then Tom Emanuel's back because his internet, and he said, yeah, could I just do a day after Tom Garth, because I am going to bring the heat. But some people think world-renowned Tolkien biographer, but I feel like I'm going to dominate Tolkien Heads today. And you should have seen the text chain between him and John Garth talking junk. It was impressive. Anyway,
I'm gonna get the pay-per-view later. So,
and we're excited that Jason is back. And how are you doing, Jason? Your mic not clicking and all.
I'm not clicking. I'm great. I enjoyed Tom's lecture presentation, and so I'm glad to hear more from him.
Excellent.
And I enjoy watching how much you enjoy your air horn.
You do? Good.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like watching a puppy play with a stick. It's
well, you know what other button I have? A little bit later, when I ask you about how you're connecting your sermon from last Sunday to the Legendarium, and then you're like, oh, how's that going to go? And I'm like, Legendary. Legendarium. Like that. I could do that. I could. But I might do something else. You never know. It's time for Jason Michele to talk about the lectionary and the Legendarium. Yeah. But now it's time for us to ask Tom some exciting questions. Ooh, it almost timed perfect with your hands. So do that again, but slow, Tom. Yeah, Tom. Okay, so we are excited for you to be here. We have a couple of questions that we asked you last time, but it was hard to follow all the answers. So we're going to pretend it didn't happen. But before we jump into it, I want to hear exactly what was the point you decided, I'm a vocational in a congregation minister, and I think I'm just going to go halfway across the world and do a PhD on Tolkien.
That is a more complicated question than I feel I can give a brief answer to. But I will say this, that when I initially discerned my call to ministry in my early 20s, I was right in the middle of reading The Lord of the Rings. I have reread it at strategic points throughout my life, and it has seemed to speak into my sense of theology, my sense of call. And I had just finished reading it aloud to my oldest child. It was the first book we ever read aloud to little Ari Emanuel. And we we completed it, and the experience of sharing it with him was so powerful and so meaningful for me and for us as a family that I knew I wanted to dive deeper into Tolkien and to explore the ways in which this story means for me and for the millions of people for whom it's this crucial text.
And so one of the ways we've been getting to know each of the guests at Tolkien Heads is ask them this wild and crazy game is taking place all across the internet, namely when we talk to people, but also sometimes commenters in the group tell us answers. You have 3 questions. Number 1, you want to tell us who you want to go to Pound Town with at the Prancing Pony. When you get up at the Prancing Pony on maybe a stool, maybe you're sitting at a wooden table across from someone, and you're going to have multiple pints while you tell stories. Who do you want to go to the Prancing Pony with? Number 2, you're going to tell us, hey, it's a battle of Helm's Deep. Who am I counting kills with? Who do I want beside my side so I make sure I get out of this battle alive and survive until the Riders of Rohan show up? And number 3, you're going to Mordor. Who do you want to ride shotgun? You know, no Sam selection. That's cheat code. Even Garth tried to pull that one. Sam Gamgee. No Sam Gamgee. All right. So, Tom.
All right.
Prancing
so number
Pony.
1, Prancing Pony. I would love to get a number of pints with Gandalf the White specifically, because at that point he has gone through the fire, he's won the day, he's accomplished his mission, and now is able to tell all the stories that an immortal angelic wizard would have to tell. And so I would love to get him sitting down and just hearing stories and hearing tales. In terms of my battle partner at Helm's Deep, you know what? Oldie but goodie. I'm going with Gimli. Dwarves are stout defenders in a tight place. Plus, he makes me look taller and more imposing by contrast.
I'm with you.
Because perhaps you cannot tell on camera, dear viewers, but I am not the world's most hyper-masculine warrior type. It's the glasses, I'm afraid. So I'm going with Gimli, both because he's a fierce defender and he makes me look good. And finally, I'm going to Mordor. Well, you want a hobbit because hobbits have a unique propensity to resist the lures of the ring. They're also not particularly noticeable. They're a good group to go along with. So I'm going to take Merry. I'm going to take Merry very specifically because at the beginning of the adventure, he is by far the most competent member of the journey. You walk out the door at Buckleberry, they're heading off to the Breeland. Frodo takes them on all sorts of wrong shortcuts. Sam is still finding his feet as a hero. Pippin is and remains too stupid to live.
Yep.
Merry's the one who makes the arrangements. He's the one who knows the territory. He's the one who's going to get you where you need to go. And he's got a little bit more maturity than Pippin, who develops, absolutely. But I'm taking Merry with me.
There you go.
Solid choice.
You don't want to go on that development journey with Pippin.
The Ring of Power. Yeah. Yes.
So I guess too, Tom, we want to know all the things about you regarding Lord of the Rings and things like that in Tolkien. And so one of those things is when you're diving into Tolkien, when you're reading the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, maybe you're doing a little digging in the history of Middle-earth. What passage gets you stoked to read it? Like when you are in the middle of it and you're like, I'm almost to this particular passage, I can't wait. Which one is it?
I mean, how long you got? It's every other chapter. Every other chapter has one of these passages. One of the things I love about reading and rereading The Lord of the Rings is that some new part, or perhaps parts that have reached out to me in the past, things just jump off the page and strike me where I stand. But one that I consistently am just delighted and excited and thrilled to read is the scene in the stairs of Cirith Ungol. So Sam and Frodo are on their way to Mordor. They have not yet reached Shelob's lair, and they are sitting down together to talk about stories and the great tales of which they are a part. And there's this beautiful, tender moment between them as they bring hope to each other in the midst of the darkness of Mordor, and as they really kind of tell you all about what Tolkien thinks about stories and the power of stories. And it's where Sam's speech at the end of the Two Towers film, the Peter Jackson film, is based on, but the book version is longer and more expansive, and I think even more beautiful. So that's a part of the story that just moves me every time.
The one where in the movie he retells, you know, the songs. Oh, let's sing about it. And Frodo, oh, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere without his Sam. And then then I just start crying. But I kind of cry about 5 pages before that starts, and in the movie about 20 minutes before it gets there. Like once the battle dies down and you're back to them, I'd already start tearing up. And on my oldest is like, oh, here it goes again. Dad, are you going to pause it for a sermon on friendship? No, I'm not going to. But if you want me to, I will. Everyone needs a Sam.
Tom, I'm curious what you would say is the most common mistake people have in understanding Tolkien and how in like an understanding that they bring to the text. You know, what do you think is the biggest misreading or misappropriation?
I think, as with the Bible, actually, one of the biggest mistake someone can make when reading Tolkien is to imagine that the text has one meaning, and that it is your job as the reader to figure out what that is and convince other people that it's the correct reading. Tolkien.
Can you give us a for instance of people doing that?
For instance, of people doing that, sure. So my research focuses on the intersection between Tolkien and theology and the way that we do theology with Tolkien's world, and particularly with The Lord of the Rings. And I find that certain scholars, maybe if you want to start stuff on our live stream, I can name names, but
yes, you have to.
We're always here for beef.
Don't dangle that out there and move on.
All right, so I'll use a specific concrete example. So in my research recently, I read a book by a Tolkien scholar named Bradley Birzer. It's called J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, and it is written from the perspective of a fairly conservative Catholic persuasion, arguing that The Lord of the Rings is best and in fact can only be rightly understood as a Catholic fantasy whose goal, the goal of reading it, is eventually to accept the truth of the Christian religion, specifically as expressed through the teachings and traditions of the Catholic Church, and that this is not only a possible reading of the text, but is the correct reading of it. And it's the reading that Tolkien would have wanted us to have as the author of the text. So Birzer is far from alone in this perspective, but he's representative.
So he's like Tolkien Eric Metaxas.
Sure.
Ruining Tolkien like Metaxas ruined Bonhoeffer.
But I think it's a misunderstanding about the nature of stories. I think it's a misapprehension about Tolkien's own project in writing fantasy. If Tolkien had wanted to convert us to a particular line of thought, he
did a bad job of it.
Well, he did a tremendously bad job of it. And he could have easily written an essay or an argument. He was perfectly capable of laying down a reasoned argument with multiple steps if you read his essays and some of his letters. But he didn't do that. He wrote a story. And I think that trying to cram all the possible meanings that somebody can find in his story as long and beautiful and complex as The Lord of the Rings into, well, this is the correct version of Christianity, and the book is just a vessel for that. I think that's short-sighted.
Okay, that's good. That's helpful.
And Tom, just picking up, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to see your work and I'm excited for when you finish your PhD to see what comes of it, because I feel like as your popularity has people have come to your Twitter and seen your takes, that there's so few people dealing with Tolkien's theology, but particularly progressive people that do it with nuance. And people, I think that Tripp and Jason and I have had feelings about Tolkien, and we read someone like Joseph Pierce or, Birch, and we're like, we love to see the theology of Tolkien, but we're just not really into this weird right wing proselytizing. So I guess from somebody who's basically like, in my mind, in my experience, that you're like the progressive go-to guy in the theology world for Tolkien, one of the first people to do this. Like what is something that you're excited to kind of what trails are you excited to blaze in your research?
I'm particularly interested in thinking about narrative itself as a kind of theology. One of the foundations of Tolkien's project as a fantasy writer is the idea that certain kinds of truths can't be communicated through logical argument. They can only be communicated through stories. Myths embody something true about the human experience or about the human relationship to God or to the gods or to the transcendent. And rather than making an argument for that, he offers a practical demonstration of it in The Lord of the Rings. So I'm really interested to look at The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work as not sacred text per se, but maybe sub-sacred text or secondary sacred text, as stories that communicate deep and meaningful truth about the human experience, but which are certainly open to some of the more conservative interpretations that people lay on them. I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't admit that conservative readings of Tolkien have a basis in the text. But I think that progressive readings of Tolkien also have a basis in the text. So applying the reading strategies of progressive Christianity and of progressive theology to The Lord of the Rings, it's not totally dissimilar to the hermeneutic battles that take place over whether we can read the Bible in a queer way or whether we can read it from the perspective of Black liberation, for instance. And I certainly think that we can, and I think The Lord of the Rings is not going to command primary world belief from most readers in the sense of we think the events in it actually happened, but it certainly does seem to capture our imagination in ways that I think are meaningfully similar to the way that our imaginations are captured by the Gospels, in the Christian tradition at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like from your presentation, I thought that was a good the way you just clarified or put very succinctly that C.S. Lewis, for example, is using story to make an argument. Tolkien is telling a story that is also just theologically shot through, but it's not trying to articulate or persuade to a particular point of view.
And I think it would be reductive to say that Lewis was incapable of telling a good story, or that he reduced every story that he told to the moral that you were supposed to get at the end of it. But I do think that he tended to come from that more proselytic perspective, and that I think has it makes me enjoy his work less, quite frankly. When I get to the end of one of the Chronicles of Narnia, for instance, and the injunction is made for me to turn back to the world in which I live and find Christ. It's like, well, isn't the story enough, Jack? Could I actually just could I get spiritual sustenance from reading Narnia, from being in this world that I think has a lot to recommend it, a lot to critique as well, and with Tolkien, certainly there's plenty to critique in Tolkien, but didacticness, I'm not sure if that's the proper word, but you know what I mean. The noun form of didacticism is not typically one of his traits as a storyteller.
So as a pastor and someone interested in theological stuff as well as Tolkien, there's mention in the stories, of an agency at work in the world. So talk about how, what is there a God in Middle Earth, and how do we understand that?
So in Middle Earth, in the cosmological mythology of Middle Earth, a God does exist, Eru Iluvatar, the one who calls the universe into being with song, and particularly when you get into Tolkien's writings in the Silmarillion and impinging pretty directly on the narratives of the Second Age of Middle-earth that are going to show up in this upcoming Amazon series. Questions of the existence and agency of God in the world loom large. But particularly in the works that most people are most familiar with, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and I think most of the actual stories of the Silmarillion, God, Eru, the One, doesn't take an active role, or at least doesn't take an active role in the sense of as a character making decisions in the same way that, say, an Aslan would be an active character in the Chronicles of Narnia. Or for that matter, Jesus, if your Christology holds that Jesus is God, is making active choices in the biblical narrative, right? So in Middle-earth, God is to be found less in the interventions of a personal deity, and I would argue more in the workings of chance, if chance you call it. The theological idea of providence runs through Tolkien's work, that God works not through, well, except in a couple cases, doesn't work through intervening directly in history, but rather is suffused through the events of the narrative and is that chink in the armor of fate through which new possibilities can emerge.
Chink in the armor of fate. I'm going to steal that. That's good.
I'm paraphrasing from something that Ulmo, the Lord of the Sea, says in a text published in Unfinished Tales, but Tolkien says it better than me, as he says most things better than me.
One of the questions that came in was really asking for clarity just around the concept of Eucatastrophe and how much that concept is tied to the larger framework that especially for those only familiar, right, with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, like how does that picture of the transcendent and the divine in the larger legendarium help us think through what Tolkien's getting at in the concept of Eucatastrophe?
So Eucatastrophe, I think it helps to look at the epilogue or the conclusion to his essay on fairy stories, where he really draws the explicit parallel between the idea of the happy ending, the glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, and the Christian narrative, because he says that for him as a Catholic who believed that the events of the Gospels happened in history, for Tolkien, the incarnation is the Eucatastrophe of human history, as the resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the Gospels. It is that moment that you couldn't pre-plan or presuppose happening, but which introduces completely relativizes the way that things are and introduces this radical new possibility, and that this is achieved through the what he calls the internal consistency of reality in the story. So the idea that the story is so structured that when the Eucatastrophe arrives, when this sudden joyous turn happens, it doesn't feel like a cheap Deus Ex Machina, right? It feels like something that has been earned, that emerges from the texture and the fabric of the story itself. In my lecture, I talk about the Eucatastrophe of the Lord of the Rings and how Gollum, being the one ultimately to destroy the ring, is quite brilliant, and but also, if you'd started at the beginning of the novel, I mean, honestly, you might assume that Gollum gets redeemed in the end. If you're following the sort of like classic like setup and payoff logic of a novel, you might think, oh well, they're going to keep leaving him alive, and Gollum's going to come around in the end, and it'll be that moment of Gollum actually being able to, or Sméagol actually being able to choose the good that will transform things. And it's not actually. The Lord of the Rings is a tragedy as much as it is a fairy tale, but because of the logic of the narrative, we come to that moment and it feels right. It feels real. It feels like it expresses something true about being in the world where you can't just count on a happy ending and you have to keep moving forward. with the hope of new possibility, but not with the expectation of it. It's one of the most powerful things I think about Tolkien's world, is that hope is never guaranteed. It's a practice as opposed to a promise. Well, I was going to say a practice as opposed to a promise. That's not quite right, but to say that I think there's a way in which the Christian narrative and the Eucatastrophe of resurrection, however you understand that, can become really triumphalistic. Like, oh, well, Jesus has been resurrected, or resurrection is the underlying pattern of reality, so everything is going to be okay in the end. And that may be true from a cosmic perspective, may not be, depending on your theology, but that kind of blitheness, I don't think, gives us the courage to actually face and the moment in all of its darkness and despair and all of its complexity. I think it tends to skate over the reality of suffering, the reality of deferred dreams and dashed hopes. And so in one of Tolkien's strengths as a storyteller is that I feel that the happy ending is never complete. It is always provisional. There's always sorrow. There is always loss in Tolkien. The tragedy is in dynamic tension with the divine comedy of the affair. And for me, at least, that feels very true to life. So that was a bit of a rambling answer. I hope that I did some
clarification. No, that's good. Because I think that's really good, because I've always thought about, so like, thinking theologically about the power of sin in the world, and the way that it enslaves, in the same way the ring does. And so it wouldn't be true, right, if because it's true in the world that the power of sin and death is such that some healing and some freedom and some redemption, like, doesn't come this side of the second coming. And so it's just a grim, sober assessment of the world that we live in.
There was in the conversation with John Garth yesterday, one of the things that came up was how attractive and compelling the vision of Lord of the Rings, Legendarium, and the richness of that universe is to people from many religious traditions, right? Like different people in this class, like not just taking it, but we're presenters that are Buddhist. Team UCC, I guess that's not you and I. And John said, I'm agnostic. I'm not really sure about the transcendent, but the world Tolkien gives is full of truth and character that I want to lean into. And one of the things you've shared online is that some of the research you're doing about narrative, and why the story of Lord of the Rings as a narrative is so compelling in our scare quote secular age. I'd love for you to kind of unpack that, maybe share a bit about how you see our current kind of cultural context and what it means to take seriously the millions of people who resonate with Lord of the Rings, or set their watch to see a new episode that comes up. Oh, there's actually new Tolkien that got released a few months ago, and you're going to go get it. Like, there's so many. They're going to cosplay. You're going to cry reading it to your kids. Like, I'm sure if you ask my kids, like, what are Dad's favorite stories? They're like, well, there's the Bible, Lord of the Rings, and then it depends on how the Lakers and Dodgers are doing. That's how it goes. So I'd love for you to take some time to frame that the big picture of where you see your research culturally, and then help us as people that all share love of Tolkien kind of see where you're hoping to go.
Absolutely. So I'll offer the title of my doctoral thesis, because I think it points toward the framework that I'm using in understanding, the role of narrative, and particularly the Lord of the Rings, in the spiritual landscape of the 21st century. So the title is "The Tale We've Fallen Into: J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Fandom, and the Post-Christian Quest for Meaning." And so when I use that term post-Christian, I'm not, of course, suggesting that the world has necessarily moved beyond Christianity, or that Christianity is no longer relevant or no longer a living tradition, that it's been outmoded in this kind of, the new atheist kind of way, that it's a relic of an older era that we need to dispose of in order to move into a bright, new, progressive future. Rather, what I'm saying is that we live in a world pretty inescapably, at least in the capitalist developed West, where religion as a monolithic cultural force has lost its hegemonic power. That certainly in the United States, obviously, it exercises an enormous amount of political power, and in other places in the capitalist so-called West, but that it is no longer the baseline assumption of culture is that it's Christian specifically, or religious more broadly, that we live in a secular age, in the sense that sacred stories and sacred narratives and religious traditions have been pushed out of the center of our life, of our economic, of our political, of our social and geopolitical life, to be replaced, quite frankly, with the idolatry of capital, with the idolatry of a mode of production and a way of understanding the world that sees, in fact, nothing is sacred, where everything is raw material, and where it's catch as catch can in order to increase personal wealth and power. And if that means that you have to obliterate every green space in the world and doom the rest of humanity to compounding climate crisis, and so be it, if the quarterly profits go up for a handful of bug-eyed salamanders in Silicon Valley next quarter. So what that effectively does is, in seeing both people and the world itself, the created world itself, as a commodity, as a resource to be extracted and exploited, well, you have to disenchant it. It can't be something that is somehow expressed. It can't be sacramental. It can't be infused with the spirit of God, or the spirit of gods. It can't be infused with a sense of sacredness. It has to be deadened. It has to be disenchanted. It has to be rendered as a commodity, right? As something that can be exchanged and destroyed and accumulated. And so religion has been faced in the Western tradition, the capitalist West, with accommodation, right? The way that we see a lot of American Christianity just sort of puts the veneer of Jesus on a capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal, imperial project, or sort of pushed to the sidelines. I mean, I think this is one of the weaknesses of liberal Christianity, is that we make some really good claims, but it doesn't fundamentally transform the way we live our economic and social lives a lot of the time. It seems like we're saying the right things and identifying the right problems, but our faith has not driven us to transform the way that we live, or to transform the society in which we live that life. So in that context, I mean, obviously this is a broad sweep. I'm making some huge generalizations, right, about the scope of history and the nature of the modern moment. But one of the reasons that I think Tolkien resonates with that is because he was just at an earlier era in the same process. Tolkien is, as we talked about with John Garth and in Tolkien's biography, coming of age and writing at this moment in the development of capitalist modernity, where the English countryside is being destroyed, and European imperial powers are expanding into all the non-white parts of the globe and expanding their markets and using the powers unleashed by the Industrial Revolution to turn the entire world into a marketplace. And that's leading to the breakdown of all these stories and all these rituals and all these traditions and communities that had shaped life and given it meaning up to that point. And so Tolkien is writing in a context in which the overriding narratives of something like Catholicism, for instance, are becoming increasingly less credible to more and more people.
Mm-hmm.
it's harder to believe the stories of these traditions that were emerged out of the pre-modern era, at least in any kind of literalistic or small o orthodox way, for a lot of people, just because they look around the world and they see the vast titanic social forces at play, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of relevance to their lives or to what's happening in the world. And so the Lord of the Rings, specifically, but I think Tolkien's Legendarium more broadly, is the work of a deeply faithful man with one foot firmly rooted in a love of nature and the pre-modern world, but another foot very firmly planted in modernity, of someone who's living in the world as it is and responding to the pressures of his time. And so he's offering a way to re-enchant the world that doesn't require you to necessarily believe in his specific brand of Catholicism, but that brings a lot of, I think, the same aesthetics and the same ethos and the same ethics over, that makes the fundamentals, like the felt experience of Christianity, like credible and believable, in part by stripping away the actual edifice of it and leaving a sense of wonder at the natural world and a trust in smallness and the power of friendship and community, and a sense that that we are called to do what is hard and to live in hope even when the march of history seems going from bad to worse. So that is my statement of the condition of postmodernity in 5 minutes or less. I will not be taking questions.
Yeah, save it for the Viva. You in your title you mentioned fandom, and I wonder if you want to kind of expand on that. Yes, there's the stories. Yes, there's the life of Tolkien, but the life of Tolkien and the stories, in so many ways, only exist because the community resonates so deeply with those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely right. And I think that fandom is important because we don't, as humans, we don't make meaning. We don't do anything alone, right? We do things together in community. And I'm really interested in the way that fandom, so these communities that come together around shared stories and around the process of interpreting stories together and of making meaning with them and using them as common reference points, and indeed, to a certain extent as guides to the way we want to be in the world, as inspiration for the kinds of people we want to be. I think that in the same way that the dynamics of a story like The Lord of the Rings are not dissimilar to the dynamics of the Gospels and the Christian tradition, I think the dynamics of fandom, a community of secondary believers brought together around a shared text, is not totally dissimilar to the dynamics of a religious and spiritual community. And so my research is really teasing out in what way does interpretive community around shared texts that are not explicitly religious fulfill some of the important social and even spiritual functions that religions have traditionally fulfilled, not as a replacement necessarily for being a Buddhist or an animist or a pagan or a Christian, but as a space in which we can actually get some of those needs for meaning and community met.
Mm-hmm. And it, like, certainly there's the sense too of the, like, I mean, it's a living text, right? I mean, like, Nick knows far more about Middle Earth than Tolkien probably did. So that, like, the text lives on in the community of those fans. Yeah.
We've got Tobias in the chat said, I'd go to that church. And Tobias, I also concur. I would also go to the church of J.R.R. Tolkien.
And you get to smoke pipes instead of having incense.
You'd have to you'd have to be like strict though, because you wouldn't want the church to become like the Renaissance fair here in Northern Virginia, where like some people are dressed in like Renaissance outfits, but then there's like the random person dressed as Milo Rambaldi from alias, and then just the other people who are clearly just wearing like their sex costumes because this is the one place they can wear them out in public. So you'd have to like exercise some rules about, you know, what is Middle Earth appropriate attire to come to the Church of Tolkien.
I feel like that's just going to be a problem no matter what religious area you're in. I mean, I'm just thinking of weird people who dress up like Jesus, you know, every Easter and do the crucifixion play. It's very strange.
Look, man, I don't care what you wear to church. I just need this to have the inner consistency of reality, right? Like I don't need to be one thing or another. I just need it to be consistently believable fiction.
Amen. I think one of the things too, and that reminded me of one of the points you made in your lecture, Tom, where you were kind of comparing and contrasting C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And I just remember kind of feeling the emotion that you were kind of expressing. And you said Tolkien was out to make a world. And you said that with such emphasis. And I was like, I don't know why. It was like a Zen Buddhist moment where like it just, you know, reality hit me like a lightning bolt. But just that, just the importance and that experience of that world, the realness of that world. Like how would you see like that as being central to the importance? You know, we've been talking about like specific theologies about Tolkien and fandoms and interpretations, but as far as like just the experience of realness that that Middle Earth brings, could you give us some of your thoughts on just the importance of that?
Absolutely. So the Latin American liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, you know, famously said that experience is primary, theology follows. That our thoughts about God, or for that matter about God in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, necessarily is a kind of reflection on the actual experience of the world as it comes to us. That's the primary text that we're exegeting. And I think that when I talk to people about why they love The Lord of the Rings or about Tolkien's world, you know, people will bring up themes, right? I mean, part of my research is actually I want to look at what is it that draws people to the spirituality of Middle Earth. What is it that they find in it that is spiritually or existentially meaningful for them? But when I speak with people, it's often, you know, some people will bring up the theme of friendship or the theme of courage or the theme of hope, but more often than not, they love the characters and they love the world. Tolkien has sometimes been accused of over-describing trees. And look, having just read the book aloud to one small child and now in the process of reading it aloud to a second small child, the walking and the tree descriptions take up a lot of paper. It takes up a lot of paper. But what it does is it creates a felt sense of being in Middle Earth that I think is so... That's a huge part of what's so powerful about it for people, is it really does feel like another world that we can step into. Garth, in his most recent book, you know, argues that one of Tolkien's great strengths as a writer is his ability to imagine and then describe in exacting detail places that never existed. Mm-hmm. Right? And to make us feel as though they existed, or that they make us feel as though they exist. And Tolkien, in his essay on fairy stories, talks about one of the reasons that fantasy does this is because when you read the words on a page, he's not giving you a specific image. He's not showing you, well, actually Lothlorien is the woods of Warwickshire, of Oxfordshire, like it's a specific place. He's evoking it with language, but you as the reader then come to it and are able to think, oh, what are the forests that have been most important to me? What are where are the places that have shaped my sense of the sacredness of the natural world? For me, it's, you know, the Black Hills of South Dakota, Paha Sapa, which is where I was born and raised on Lakota land. And so when I read Lothlorien, it immediately evokes for me this powerful sense, not only of a place that's alien and strange, but also really deeply familiar. It calls to my own experience of the beauty and wonder of creation and brings that into the text with it. And I think that I'm not going to, I think that, cis white men have a bad habit of generalizing our experience of texts onto everybody else. But I think that goes on with a lot of people, right? I think that a lot of people are having, if not the same, then similar experiences about the way that the Lord of the Rings evokes these real world experiences of sacredness. And in so doing, then hopefully when we come back to the world as it is, allows us to see it with the eyes of recovery, as Tolkien calls it, to see it as a place that was sacred the whole time. God was in this place, but I was not aware of it, right? Like Jacob.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
I love how you kind of tied in recovery, because I was gonna fall into like the incorrect, just thinking about Tolkien transforming the mundane. And it's really that for Tolkien, what we call mundane and what modernity has done has really killed off what has been alive the whole time. And how, if we're really going to participate in what fantasy does, and even myth and spirituality, is to help us actually see with new eyes what reality has, and how that reality is going to continue to look different every time we return. We jump back into Middle Earth, we come back into the real world, and how each time Middle Earth is going to look different, and so is our present experience.
One of the questions that got sent in from the group, I think, fits here, and it's also one that I imagine you could go back and forth. So if Tom, and Nick, if y'all have thoughts about it, I'm always down to hear super nerds say things. But so Jess sent in a question, to which he must have liked you because he turned you into Tom Holland, and I feel like as a Spider-Man fan, that's quite the compliment. But I wonder if Holland,
maybe meant like the historian Tom Holland.
That seems more likely.
I was thinking of Spider-Man. Okay, well, I wonder if Tom, the theologian, sees fantasy as done by Tolkien as an exercise in theology, as imaginative human construction, drawing on something like human creativity in the spirit of someone like Gordon Kaufman. While Lewis is more rationalistic and more didactic in drawing on a Christian schema, Tolkien's creativity seems honestly creative for its own sake.
So, in answer, broadly speaking, yes to the first part about Tolkien's sort of fantasy and sort of philosophical and theological project. Now, I want to be fair where it's called to be fair to Jack Lewis, is that I think that he and Tolkien are, if you believe that fantasy, as Tolkien did and as Lewis did, is this sort of God-given, we're partaking of our God-given and in fact God-infused ability to create, to subcreate, to make worlds, to be storytellers and to be creators, then even a relatively didactic fantasy, even something like that has a clear moral at the end of it, can still have the effect of drawing us into a world and transforming the way we see both it and our own. But I would say that there's the Patrick Curry, who wrote another a pretty good book, not perfect, but a good book about Tolkien and modernity, argues that one of the things that makes him so successful as a writer is that he really fuses together Christian sense of transcendence, a pagan sense of the animateness of the natural world, and then this humanistic strain of the power of imagination and the power of individuals to have a role in this wider unfolding. So I'm not familiar with the author that Jess, I think it was, brought up, but I do think that that's a pretty a fair assessment of Tolkien's project.
Yeah, Gordon Kaufman, the theologian he mentioned, is a very liberal Protestant theologian, and I think UCC. He was at where was he at? I think he was at Harvard's Div School for a long time. I read a bunch of his stuff back in like 10 years ago, and since he had asked, I pulled it out, and here's one of the lines that I thought, okay, this might be where he's going. Creativity is not just the activity of God in relationship to the world, but God in relationship to God's self. And as one comes to participate in the divine creativity, love will be flowing in and between one's neighbor, one's enemy, and all creation. The activity of being human and our generative creativity with one another is the practice of the presence and activity of divine creativity in this world. And goes on in this whole, anyway, it's very beautiful. Very beautiful. But he has a couple books, on creativity. But don't worry, I'm not going to have an excursus. But his critique of the concept of creativity in Whitehead is wrong. So for the all other person on here that knows about that. Here's something I had started texting Nick about, and that I just got, the new J.R.R. Tolkien book. It's called The Nature of Middleearth, which is tons of fun because there's like whole sections on metaphysics in a book where J.R.R. Tolkien's like answering metaphysical questions and like why Elvish language works particular ways. And I think it really picks up on something you were saying earlier, Tom, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tolkien says, in discussing gender and sex, the Elvish languages did not distinguish grammatically between masculine and the feminine. The same se, but meant he or she. But there was a very important distinction made between animate and inanimate. Animates include not only rational creatures, speaking people, but of all living things reproducing with their kind. To these were applied the dignity of pronouns. And then talks about the inanimates are namely parts. And many of those parts have their identity in a whole that is animate. And I just thought, oh, what a beautiful picture, right? Like to think of how Tolkien's just in Lord of the Rings, the way in which the kind of mechanistic machinery that's taking place and part of the awakening and of the trees, the Ents, and all those things and the deep love of nature and that kind of thing. That and the important distinction isn't the divisions between us, but the recognition of our identity with all living things. And that being woven into the Elvish language that's much more ancient and in tune with the Iluvatar. I was like, oh, hell yeah. Someone needs to put that on my lectionary. Any thoughts? I've just read it. I want to know it, like, as someone that's just finished a rough draft of a large book on panpsychism, it made me happy.
Well, I think one of the important things about the writings collected in the Nature of Middle-earth, many of them, and about Tolkien's later writings on theology and philosophy and metaphysics in his created world, is that not unlike that Gutierrez quote I offered earlier, it is secondary, right? So Tolkien has first and foremost created the languages and concurrently the stories of Middle-earth, and is now working out the metaphysical ramifications of them, or the philosophical ramifications of them. So one of the ways that I think about his later philosophical writings on Middle-earth is he's doing exegesis of his own text. He's the given is there, which is, and Tolkien often talks about this in his creative process of feeling like the stories or certain names were things given to him or that he discovered as opposed to invented, that this was a process of finding out what was already there. I mean, the genesis of Middle-earth comes from the Old English word Earendel, which appears to refer to the morning star. And Tolkien writes this poem about Earendel the mariner, and his friend Geoffrey Smith reads it and is like, well, that's fascinating, but what's it about? and Tolkien famously replied, I don't know. I shall have to find out. or the genesis of writing The Hobbit, where he was grading papers. I think anybody who's ever worked in a teaching position can identify with this, and it's just completely zoned out, right? Just grading papers, and he comes to an examination paper that's mercifully blank, and just out of the blankness of his mind, just writes, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And in that moment, it's like, I wonder what a hobbit is. I shall have to find out more about that later. You can almost see the whole genesis of Middle-earth as Tolkien finding out what that meant. But that I think those writings that come in the Nature of Middle-earth are exactly that sort of thing. So it makes sense to me as he's working through sort of what are the philosophical ramifications of the stories that I've told and the language that I've constructed, that that is sort of metaphysical superstructure on top of the structure of the story and the language is going to reflect that same sense of sacred interpenetration and sacred interconnectedness.
No, this is so good, Tom. I think too, this kind of reminds me of of course, with Rings of Power coming up with adaptations, and how Tolkien himself was re-engaging with his own world and trying to make things consistent and trying to be even like humane to his own characters, like the orcs. Like obviously throughout the stories, they're basically cannon fodder, and how over time he tries to find ways to be consistent in redeeming the orcs later on. And so connecting that to one of your earlier points too, talking about like this obsession with some fans about a singular reading of Tolkien, and how diverging from that kind of shakes the ground underneath their feet of which they founded. And so when we get into things like the Rings of Power, like with some of the controversy around people of color playing elves and things like that, and just saying that fans are saying that is totally disrespecting Tolkien's world, but just in the spirit of Tolkien as he's kind of reworking his world, can you speak into just like what's happening with the Rings of Power and the excitement that comes along with the transformation that it's bringing, and also the problematic stuff from toxic fans?
Absolutely. So I think your point about Tolkien's reconsideration of the orcs and their place in sort of the moral universe of Middle-earth is really telling, because as he moved toward the end of his life and he's reflecting back on this world that at that point he spent decades in, we find him thinking more critically about the moral status of the orcs. Some good scholarship has been done to show that his characterization of dwarves changes noticeably from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, specifically because he, became more aware of some of the anti-Semitic tropes that are inherent in a lot of Northern and Western European stories about dwarves. And in the wake of the Second World War, obviously, and the death camps, he was trying to engage more critically with some of the tropes that he'd borrowed from his own literary tradition, right? I like to imagine that if Tolkien had lived longer, he perhaps might have done some similar work with, say, the Southrons or the Easterlings, right? Because he's clearly borrowing from this kind of Orientalist tradition of othering the South and the East, right? And of setting up non-white peoples as evil and as the enemy. And you see this. I mean, you see him problematizing it in places in the Lord of the Rings, even in Ithilien, when Sam sees the downed Haradrim soldier of Harad, and wonders what brought him to this war and whether he ever wanted to be here in the first place. But I think so in Tolkien, we already see actually, and my advisor at the University of Glasgow, Dimitri Fimi, has done some wonderful work showing how Tolkien's vision evolved over time, that it wasn't just a static world, but that he was learning more about not only just about the languages and the history and the stories, but also thinking through, again, the ramifications of, what does it mean in a world where racialization is such a baked in part of a lot of the mythos, right? And we have to name that, right? I think part of the reason that fans of color are so excited, it says the white guy to a room of, I'm assuming white guys, I guess I shouldn't assume that, but we certainly look pale in this room. But what I've heard from my friends and other fans of color is that finally they're seeing themselves represented in the heroes of Middle-earth, right? Rather than having to do these reparative readings of perhaps telling the story from the perspective of the horror dream, or of, you know, sort of race flipping canon characters, or of taking the fact that Sam Gamgee is consistently described as brown skinned and then reading him as a character of color, right? Which I think is a perfectly valid interpretive strategy. You know, there is definitely a kind of fan, and it's funnily enough often the exact same kind of fan who are really insistent that the Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth is a deliberate Christian form of proselytization. It turns out that the one real interpretation of Middle-earth in the eyes of certain kinds of fans and scholars really is a blatantly Christian Western imperialist vision. But so in the Rings of Power, you know, I haven't seen the show. We've seen some total of a few minutes of it. I remain basically skeptical of any and all screen adaptations of Tolkien's work. I'm skeptical of Amazon.com and the economic incentives built into 5 series of prestige streaming television. But I'm super here for Black Elves. I think it would be cool if more of the canon characters that are portrayed on the show were portrayed as people of color. I'm glad Tarmiriel, the Queen Regent of Numenor, is a woman of color. I wish that they had gone and made more Noldor of color, for instance, rather than, it seems a lot of the new characters that have been invented for the show are often those who are given more diverse identities. And like, well, you know, what about a brown Celebrimbor? How about that? You know?
No, I think that distinction is so important too in this conversation of the types of concerns to approaching adaptations, to where I've seen your takes on Twitter where, you know, you have beef with some of the creative decisions that Peter Jackson has done, and then obviously talking about some of the non-canonical characters, but how that's not rooted in some weird Christo-fascist attempt at, you know, preserving Western culture, you know. So I think I think a lot of fans, I know a lot of people who are really skeptical of Amazon for none of the weird, creepy alt-right reasons, but feel like they can't have opinions because they might get, you know, thrown in with that alt-right crowd.
Sure.
Who is so racist that they like out loud would say, I don't want that fictional character to be played by a person of color because it doesn't match the picture in my head. Like, that's so, like,
good question.
That's so ridiculous.
If you want your like soul to die, Jason, just go to the YouTube comments of the Amazon trailers. It's astounding, the explicit.
Well, in my land of make believe, she's always been white. So they're like, oh my gosh, who says that out loud?
Well, I'm guessing they aren't listeners of your podcast, Jason.
I'm just, I guess Middle-earth gone woke. It's just
Here's the thing, though. Again,
tragedy.
is this? I don't think the fact that it's the same people who are complaining about wokeness in schools who are complaining about queer readings of the Bible are also those who won't allow you to have queer readings of Lord of the Rings or elves of color in Middle-earth, including, you know, Carl Hostetter, the editor of The Nature of Middle-earth, had some pretty suspect or pretty unfortunate comments about readers, particularly queer readers, using some of Tolkien's meditations on gender and sexuality and the metaphysics of that in order to celebrate queer readings of the text. And he pushed back against that in some, I think, fairly unfortunate ways. You know, even it's also important to remember that these texts are The Nature of Middle-earth, and anything that's been published after Tolkien's death is edited. You know, it's not. This is Tolkien being compiled, his sources being edited, redacted, compiled, and clarified by his son Christopher or by other editors. And so we can we can read them critically in the same way that we might read the redaction of, say, the book of Genesis critically. Again, not to elevate the Lord of the Rings to biblical proportions, but I do think, again.
But it's interesting that it's interesting that people would use these texts in the same way that they use scripture texts. Because someone has a line here about gatekeeping. It becomes a device by which we accrue righteousness over and against other people. No, this is the correct way to read this. You don't know enough. It's just fascinating.
Do you think part of it? You mentioned the connection between the religious expression those readers have. Like, part of it, I think, is a lot of people don't have a live experience with an expression of a religious tradition that receives this tradition and honors it by rereading it in the present. And I think that is something that, when you haven't had that experience, the word Christian, your identity as a Christian then ends up tied, to this kind of like white supremacist, imperialist adjacent expression. One of the things, like you as a minister, me, Jason, and our experiences in much more progressive congregations is that those congregations can be advocates for all sorts of beautiful and justice-centered things in their community. It can be places you wrestle with the biggest questions of existence, and you do something beautiful by every year exegeting the story and parables of Jesus and then put them in our own context, right? So, like, when I was a minister in Los Angeles, there are tons of really important justice questions that are so tied to the fact that people that lived in the area where you served in Long Beach, where I served in South Bay, that there's all this childhood asthma, the long-term health outcomes that are because our congregants drive for 45 minutes, if they're lucky, an hour and 20 minutes, getting exhausted to their work and back and forth every day. And some of them come to visit our churches because they're pretty and big. And like, once those things show up in your prayer of confession, then you realize that you have read, right, that seeking of justice in the life and ministry of Jesus is something that we should care for and attend to. And you relive it and you reinscribe it in your world. And that can be a life-giving and inspiring thing. And part of the things we have to confess as the church are the ways we've been blind and complicit and lazy and haven't acknowledged our connection to all sorts of injustices. But
and you mentioned beauty. It's kind of revolting to take this great gift that is either scripture or these narratives that Tolkien wrote, and only want to use them for some other end. To not enjoy the story for the sake of the story, but to have it be some sort of apology for Western culture, or it has to have this principle behind it. Just receive the gift that, like, he gave us.
I think that when an identity, whether it's as an American or a man in our particular milieu or a Christian, when an identity is fragile, that the possibility of reading narratives in ways that admit other identities or other experiences is really threatening, right? That things need to have one correct reading in order for one to maintain one sense of self in the face of a world that certainly is going from bad to worse. We can be frank about that. And I think that I have a certain amount of empathy for the place that these kinds of exclusivistic and we can say fundamentalist readings of these texts come from. I have some empathy for that. I don't have a lot of sympathy for the way that it shows up, and I think that it's not to say that those readings are invalid or unsupported by the text, but I think you have to admit that these are always choices we make, that these are interpretive choices, that the text is not clear one way or the other, that texts are always multivalent. They say multiple things. It's why Jesus taught in parables as often as he did anything else, because you want to know who your neighbor is. Well, I'm not going to give you a rundown of the characteristics of your neighbor. I'm going to tell you a story about a Samaritan on the road to Jericho, and that's going to tell you, through the evocation of your imagination and challenging your preconceptions, much more about what it means to be a neighbor and what it means to have a neighbor than would any, kind of bullet point list, right? But I think that the tradition itself, and particularly I think in Jesus' Jewish tradition, is really open to more multivalent readings of texts, and that is threatening if your worldview depends on a series of interlocking, increasingly tenuous intellectual assertions that have to be bound together, right? You pull one thread, to use a different metaphor, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. You have to consider, wait a minute, maybe I'm actually vulnerable before God and my fellow human beings. Oh my God, and then what? And I'm speaking, of course, I'm not of myself too. This is the ego. This isn't some uniquely like conservative, or for that matter liberal thing. I think it's a human thing.
One of the questions that came in that I would be interested in your thoughts was, what's the deal with the lack of religion in Lord of the Rings and its overwhelming present in Game of Thrones? Yeah, I was about to go into another 5 minutes of the question, but I mean, it is a striking contrast, especially given the more substantive elements of Lord of the Rings.
There's a lot of other differences too.
There are, as a matter of fact,
not nearly as rapey in Middle Earth.
Yeah, I have my issues with George R.R. Martin. Not a giant fan, although I can admit that he's a very talented storyteller for certain values of storytelling. So I can speak to the absence of religion in Middle Earth really is a conscious choice by Tolkien, because part of the fiction of Middle Earth is that it's set as this kind of prehistoric or proto-historic past of our world, right? The Lord of the Rings itself, and the Hobbit for that matter, and the Silmarillion, they're presented as texts that have been compiled and then translated by Tolkien, the editor and translator, and brought to us from this earlier period of human or elvish or hobbitic history, as the case may be. And so for him, it's important that it's not a tool of proselytization. So he doesn't want the Christian religion present in it. Anyway, it doesn't really make sense for it to be there if this is some sort of proto-history before the history that we know. But also because he talks about it wanting to be consonant with Christianity, or with the doctrines of Christianity. Stephen Yandel, who you're going to hear from later, gave a great presentation at a conference a few months ago where he talked about fantasy, and particularly Middle Earth, as like a theological playground, right? Where like a place where one can ask questions about God and about like anthropology and about the world and about the problem of evil that orthodoxy, small o, maybe doesn't have space for, or can't ask, and can actually like poke at the edges of what acceptable theology is. But of course, it's all a fantasy world, right? It's not the real world. So there's a certain safety in that, even for someone as devout in his faith as Tolkien. And Tolkien consistently grappling with the role of religion, not only in Middle Earth, but also in whether or not his project Okay, that was in me. Great. So whether or not his project is actually consistent with his beliefs and with his faith. His short story Leaf by Niggle presents a man who's worried that his constant puttering away at this weird project in his garage is actually getting in the way of his like duty to be a good neighbor and to be a good person. So I think that the absence of religion in Middle Earth is in some ways its least realistic element. The fact that they're, apart from a handful of references to, for instance, the dinner grace that Faramir and the ranges of Ithilien practice, or the mountain of Numenor, the Menaltarma, where the kings and the people go to on a feast day to acknowledge the existence and of Iluvatar. Basically, rites and rituals in Middle Earth are reserved for the ones that we see the most of are actually ones that set up either Morgoth or Sauron as gods, as these idolatrous deities who are to be worshipped, and which require, in the case of Sauron's temple to Melkor in Numenor, like actual human sacrifice. So I think Tolkien, it must be said, is in a lot of ways fairly like devout and even traditional Catholic, and making his world, which is certainly, I think, inspired and grounded in his faith, but also goes far beyond small O Orthodox, sort of Catholicism in some important ways. It was a constant negotiation for him, and I think absenting it from the narrative both helps it to feel more. Weirdly enough, helps it to feel more real and helps it to be less of a sermon, but also functions as a way to maybe keep Tolkien himself safe from some of the actual theological ramifications of the things he's addressing in his world.
So this is something. So I'm the guy. So I did try to learn Elvish when I was in middle school, right? And I had a friend who taught himself, likewise. So I'm nerdier than the average reader of the book and viewer of the movies, but I'm not a Nick level nerd. And so what I'm curious about is what was the initial reception to the Fellowship of the Ring, for example? Like how was it received by readers in the world?
So The Lord of the Rings, upon its first release in the 1950s, it really was a very unusual book. Certainly there had been other works of Second World fantasy. Some of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia books had come out at that point, and there had been Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast and a number of other things, The Hobbit, of course. But it was definitely something this expansive in its world building, was a literary oddity. Tolkien's publishers, George Allen and Unwin, didn't really know how to market it. Was this a fairy tale for children? Was it an adult novel? It wasn't really science fiction. Was it like a literary romance, like an Arthurian romance? The publisher originally agreed to publish it in a profit sharing agreement because they didn't figure it was going to make any money. They figured they were going to publish it and it was going to be a literary event, but nobody was going to buy a 3-volume work set in a fictional world that, with this vast sort of medieval backcloth. And it was a surprise to them when it became as... It
was Tom Bombadil, wasn't it? The editors were like, this isn't going to work with Tom Bombadil.
God, I love Tom Bombadil. I will defend Tom Bombadil. Look, I understand why people don't like him. I understand why he doesn't make a lot of sense in the narrative. I love him. I think he belongs there, and I will gladly spend 2 hours on another live stream fighting about that with any comers. But I would say that the critics were pretty evenly split. Some, such as W.H. Auden, loved it and thought it was brilliant. A lot of other critics thought it was absolutely bizarre and didn't know what to make of it. Some were outright contemptuous of it. And it wasn't, and it found a popular audience largely through word of mouth, but it wasn't really until the mid-1960s and the delightful sort of the story of the first paperback publication of The Lord of the Rings is a lovely little case study in the influence of publishing standards and copyright law. But really, in the mid-1960s, so a full 10 years after it had first been published, it really took off when the paperback edition by Ballantine Books was published. And it was taken up by, interestingly, the left-leaning counterculture. So college students and environmental activists and hippies came to the world and found it utterly compelling, which, of course, led a lot of literary scholars and critics to look down their nose and say, well, look, people, all those hippies are enjoying it, those young people, those plebs are enjoying it, so it must be trash in the same way that, you know, science fiction was sort of considered trash for a long time. As time has gone on, it's become sort of more of an accepted place in the like literary canon. Obviously, I think it's critically been opinions have been revised, but it's still one of those things that you know, if you like it or you absolutely do not like it.
Okay, that's helpful. I didn't know that. Thank you.
So you mentioned Tolkien functioning like a sandbox for thinking theologically. And I know before you moved, you did a series at your church kind of using Tolkien to do so. You mentioned topics like evil and suffering and such. But I'd love for you to kind of, you know, not spell the whole thing out or whatever, but like to give an invitation for people that have enjoyed it, that maybe haven't used it in that way. Or what does it sound like when you're facilitating kind of a sandbox conversation around one of those big topics? Are there particular ones that you love or stick out that you think are worth reflecting on?
You know, I think that we got into a little bit of sort of talking about, you know, race in Middle Earth and how it helps us to understand the way in which, you know, sort of race and racialization work in our own world and in the way we tell stories and who gets to be the protagonist of stories and how evil is racialized or not. Two of my other favorite sort of theological conversations were around queerness and around gender. Tolkien is not famous for having a lot of female characters. And I think it's fair to say he's not a feminist, I think, in the classic modern sense. But I do think that his work, the female characters who are there, and you know, feminist Tolkien scholars have done a lot of great work on this, are, you know, doing a lot of great work. A character like Galadriel or Éowyn or Luthien Tinuviel from the Silmarillion. These characters, although there may not be as many female characters in Middle Earth, they are often presented as powerful agents of their own stories who defy the norms of their own world and of the world of the author. But particularly in Tolkien's, you know, construction of masculinity, looking at the way in which you know, traditionally masculine, quote unquote, virtues of domination and of control are often problematized in Tolkien. And whether it's the relationship of Sam and Frodo, or of Aragorn and Boromir, or of Turin Turambar and Beleg, the elvish bowman, that we see a number of really tender and caring relationships between men in which physical affection and emotional vulnerability are built into the dynamic and presented as positive and as aspirational. Tolkien's construction of masculinity, I think, is actually much more subversive than you might think for a quote unquote boys story, as it's sometimes you know, fairly or unfairly characterized. And I think that relates pretty neatly with questions of queerness and whether we can read characters as for queer subtexts, or in some cases just pretty queer just texts. I think doing it in this world is sometimes having the exercise of reading a fictional world in these you know, sort of countercultural ways can help us then to open up space. Again, it's a kind of recovery that Tolkien talks about. It opens up space for us to read our own world in more expansive and more multivalent ways. But those were, you know, issues of race, gender, and queerness. I think were really fun topics to explore, and had a lot of folks had great perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like it. And I, you know, when I've been present for Tolkien people getting all worked up about the Sam and Frodo relationship, I always just bring up David and Jonathan from Scripture. You know, for those that don't know, there's quite a few Hebrew Bible scholars that point out that David, like King David, man after God's own heart, even though he raped Bathsheba and murdered her husband, David, that his relationship with Jonathan was more than friends, or could have been, and that's a possible reading, and it exists there in the Hebrew. It's been discussed for a long time, not just after in contemporary kind of queer theory. As I guess it's 13th century is the first time it shows up in a kind of commentary on the text. But the point being, people get really defensive, as if the text is going to give you a final answer about any of it, and yet. So in some sense, you sit there with like this potential kind of queer reading, but also it is queering the notion of masculinity for men to have deep affection and deep friendships that are that vulnerable. I'll even joke with some friends when you have like the male friend hug that's too long. And then you'll make a comment about it because you both really needed it because you hadn't had one in a while, and then you're like, well, but what do we do about this? And I think that there's kind of all these different layers to the language of queer that if people, especially people may not have been in a criticism class recently, that it's a much more broad kind of a hermeneutic than going to a text, pointing at something, and then kind of asserting a particular identity into it.
I think you're right on about that. When we do a queer reading, whether it's of the Bible or of Tolkien, it's not necessarily pointing at, for instance, Sam and Frodo and saying, hey, look, they're gay, but rather saying that, hey, look at this relationship in which two men say they love each other and have meaningful moments of physical tenderness and then move in with one another after the end of the main quest narrative. And during the unpublished epilogue, Sam's daughter Eleanor refers to Frodo as Sam's treasure and draws an explicit parallel between their relationship and the relationship of Galadriel and Celeborn, who are a married couple, right? It's not collapsing it into a single correct reading of characters as homosexual. It is rather saying, look at the way this opens up a whole world of ways we could be, of men can be with one another, or of the way that people can be with one another that aren't so rigidly defined by these cis patriarchal norms.
Yeah, and Tom, we've kind of touched on all of these very personal feelings from all scopes of fandom and scholars and all types of stuff, and I think all of us here have deep experiences and love for Tolkien's work with all of the baggage and beauty that it brings. And so for you, exploring the meaning making in a post Christian or post religious age, what are those spiritual experiences for you? What has transformed you, if you've had those spiritual experiences in Tolkien's world?
The more I reread The Lord of the Rings, and sort of the older I get with the text, the more Lothlorien in particular grabs at something deep and undefinable in me. I think in a world, I'm a millennial, I'm coming, sort of having kids in the middle of a worsening climate crisis and wondering how do we recover a sense of this world we share as sacred, and how do I cultivate with and for my kids a sense of place, a place that is infused with beauty and that has a sense of tradition and continuity with the past, but is still a home in the now. What is my responsibility as a white person born and raised in the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota in terms of how I relate to land and how I relate to the land that I'm from? How do I be a good, not just ally to the indigenous peoples of my home place, but also to the land itself? Tolkien, for me, is so deeply tuned into the life and the spirit of the natural world, and to the point that arguably Middle-earth is the primary character of the Legendarium, and that over and over again, just the sense of a world. I think I used the phrase in my lecture, charged with the grandeur of God, right? That finding the stories and the practices and the theologies and the spiritualities that can ground me in that, and that can help ground my kids in that, as I'm wanting to pass on something to them in the face of a world that looks a lot like Minas Tirith, sort of on the verge of the War of the Ring right now, and what will their future look like? So to me, increasingly, the Lord of the Rings is one of the ways that I hope to give them a world worth living in, and worth fighting for, and worth calling home in the deepest sense of home.
Awesome. Well, it's been a blast to hang out, Tom. I've really enjoyed it, and I love your ability to move between multiple conversations and thinking of all the different places in Tolkien world you hang out and are trying to weave together. I think it would be good for you to share where people can connect and follow you that are in the class. I mean, you mentioned your Twitter and stuff, but especially as you're beginning graduate studies and things, what are the best ways for people to connect? And, for those clergy that are a part of this, to invite you to come Zoom in and talk to their Tolkien reading group and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. So the best place to find me right now is at my Twitter handle. It's at Real Tom Emanuel, the spelling of my name that you see on screen. And that is, I'm going to be launching in the next couple of weeks, actually, a blog, Queer and Back Again, queering faith and fantasy in the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is going to, if you want to keep up with my research, if you want to see long form rants and ravings and wonderings and questionings about Tolkien and his world, and a little glimpse into the life of a Tolkien scholar, then you can follow that. That should launch. I'm hoping to get it out before the premiere of the upcoming Amazon series. But that's the best place if you want to kind of look after me, and then there will be other options there. And you can DM me. My DMs are open if you have questions or want to chat more in depth.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out. Any final words there, Nick?
I am going to be subscribing to your blog, Tom, as soon as it launches. So please bring it soon. Yeah.
Oh, look at the. Someone asked this question right at the end. They're gonna have to wait till next time. Why didn't the Eagles just fly the ring to Mordor? Well, look,
because that's not the way the story works. You have to assume that if they didn't fly the ring to Mordor, then they couldn't fly the ring to Mordor. All right, you just have to make some assumptions about the way that narratives work, man. I don't know why. Surely Gandalf thought of it.
I know.
He's a wizard.
Also, Balrogs don't have wings, but if you draw them, you can give them wings, and it looks cool. So there's all sorts of hot takes. But thank you, Tom. It's been a blast, and
God bless y'all.
I look forward to connecting. It's hopefully in person at some point. So
God willing.
All righty, peace,
dude.
Marie.
All right, that was fun. It was fun.
Ridiculously fun, dude.
Oh yeah. Well done, Nick. For those of you that don't know, when the Twitter exchange took place, if this was possible, I was like, look, I don't know all these Tolkien scholars. I just know I want to know them and learn from them. And Nick has been putting things together and connecting dots. So, if any of you ever see Nick, you just tell him how much you appreciate his Tolkien Rolodex. So it's not like Durin quality like your beard.
No,
but I mean it's close,
I'm working on it, and I'm acquiring them like the jewels found in Moria,
Yes. Awesome. Well, we thank you, especially for those of you that have joined 2 times in the same week. Next week, just once. Don't worry. I'm very much looking forward to doing that. And did you hear that the last episode of Rings of Power is released at midnight the day Theology Beer Camp begins?
No.
I just saw the schedule today. So for those of you that would like to day drink for a couple days, high quality craft beverages, nerd out with theologians across many disciplines, hang out with lots of podcasters, like you have permission, Bible for normal people, activist theology. Anyway, it's going to be tons of fun. But I think we know what we're going to talk about when we have the Tolkien podcast at Theology Beer Camp, because we get the last episode.
Oh yeah, and I'm gonna watch it before. But if we're not up all night doing some sort of watch party, I'm gonna be real disappointed.
Well, watch party. By then we'll have some idea of if it's like we're watching it for excitement or for pain. Like, so I really want it to be real. I want it to be like really good or really bad. I kind of want an extreme.
Yeah, I don't want any mediocrity. Like, if it's laughably bad, that'll be an enjoyment in its own right.
Yeah. Well, looking forward to it. I know Ryan Doze from the Mighty Thor podcast is also a big Tolkien head. He'll be there. Will Rose, who's the hosting Theology Beer Camp, big Tolkien head, will be there. And if y'all want to be there, just put in the word Tolkien at in the discount code. You'll get $50 off, and you can come hang out with us. But I'm excited about it. But don't worry, we'll record it for everyone that's not going to be there in person. And yes, Rebecca, it's like, if it's on the West Coast, I love the West Coast. I hope to do beer camp there again, not just because West Coast has the best beer. Easy. Tobias, I would love to go back to England. But I haven't been to the southwest side of England because I was in Scotland and it was lockdown. So I mostly did London and then all over Scotland. And what's the town that has the whole York? That's in England, and we went there and it was awesome. And England does not have better beer than like Southern California, Tobias. Look, here's the thing. I'm not a fundamentalist on a lot of things, but when it goes to craft beer, I like to make my preferences moral obligations for everyone.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Though there was in Scotland, there were a couple really. New Barns was my favorite brewery in Scotland. They make wonderful lagers, and they're in Edinburgh. Black Isle Brewery up in the Highlands was my favorite when we went up there. Colonel down south in the England area. I don't know where in England. I think it was in London. Is really good. Just all their best beers have low ABV and still cost a lot, which is just like,
Why?
UK. Yeah. I'm like, yeah. Anyway.
I still need to. I need to make my pilgrimage across the pond because I need to go to the Eagle and Child real bad.
It wasn't open when I was in Oxford.
Oh yeah.
So because I was there for most of all the COVID excitement. So I visited a lot of places around the UK on Zoom where I thought I was giving papers to an actual university. Instead, it was just a Zoom screen. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Next week, who's next week? It's
we got Chris Vaccaro next week.
Excellent. So we'll see you all then. And in his lecture, he mentions a couple specific passages in Lord of the Rings to go check out. So, if you want to be super nerdy, have your copy ready. And I will, because look at my new copy right here.
Oh, is that yours?
Yeah.
Let's go, baby.
That's what I'm talking about. I'll have it out. All righty. See you all later. Thank you for doing some Tolkien head fun.